Dwayne, where's Jody? Did everybody find a seat? Lauren, Rosio? You look a little thin this morning. Find your assigned seat. There's John Davila going in circles in the parking lot. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Julie tells me we got 2 more weeks. I learned a couple things this morning. I learned that you can tell John Rogers is the funniest joke in the world and he won't laugh.
I laugh on the inside.
He said he laughed on the inside. And I also learned that Gail Cargill is breaking with tradition and not bringing wings from Bill Miller's to the... So anyway, two episodes of just extreme disappointment for me this morning. But I'm glad to be here. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. We're winding this down. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, a lot of the Bible scholars say, there's a big shift in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And some of the Bible scholars say that this was a separate letter that was cobbled together. Now, I don't agree with that, but just so you know, that's what some of them think. And in this section, we've said before that Paul goes back and revisits things that were introduced in 1 Corinthians. This is no different. And so it's got a similar theme to it, and that is a defense of his ministry. And in fact, at the top of my New Testament, it's labeled Paul's self-vindication. I want to point out 3 passages in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 1. I, who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am of good courage toward you. Then in verse 10, for his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. Then if you look in chapter 11, verse 6, but even though I be rude in speech, yet am I not in knowledge. So I think that subject heading, the self-vindication of Paul, probably fits here. And we know from 1 Corinthians, especially chapter 9, that that he defends his apostleship, right? You wouldn't think somebody like Paul would need to defend his apostleship, but he does, because of Judaizing teachers that were wanting to teach that the Gentiles, the Greek Christians, had to be circumcised and follow different elements of the Jewish law, basically making Christianity a hybridization of Judaism. And so that was settled in Jerusalem with Peter, but they, kind of like a dog with a bone, they didn't want to give it up. And so Paul was continually having to deal with that. And so in this section, including in chapter 11, we're going to see him making a defense. So in chapter 10, it says, now I, Paul, myself, entreat you. A lot of Paul's letters were written by other people. He dictated the content, but this seems to indicate that, that here in chapter 10, when he said, now I, Paul, myself, entreat you. In verse 2, uses a different word that kind of means the same thing. I beseech you. So he's entreating and beseeching. Well, what is it? What's that about? So he entreats them in verse 1 by the meekness and gentleness of Jesus Christ. And he uses those words on purpose because he's going to claim those characteristics for himself, meekness and gentleness. Then that verse we read, I who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am of good courage toward you. So there's this great dichotomy in what Paul presents himself in writing letters, and we can certainly see in 1 Corinthians where he was all over them, right? And trying to get some things fixed, trying to get some things corrected. By the way, I was thinking about this yesterday, it'd be a good study to to maybe try to think about the Corinthians' response to that first letter. It had to have been read and reread, and they had to felt guilt. And so then they probably had to have some little congregational meeting, deal with the guy in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and to look at the accusations. Oh my goodness, we are saying I'm of Paul of Jesus Christ. And I think it'd be a good study just sort of think that out and maybe self-identifying with that and how we would respond to a letter like that. I mean, we get here in 2 Corinthians that it was a positive response, but I'm always intrigued by the details. Not that we can know that absolutely 100% for sure, but I mean, humanity and how they reason and how they think hasn't changed that much. So he's coming with the meekness and gentleness of Jesus Christ. He's in his presence, he's lowly, but being absent and of good courage. Verse 2, yes, I beseech you, and here's what he's beseeching, that I may not, when present, show courage with the confidence wherewith I count to be bold against you, who come to us as if we walked according to the flesh. So what he's beseeching and entreating is that when he comes to see them, he doesn't want to be overbearing and maybe even overreacting, but he wants to come to them in the proper way in meekness, even though the accusation is that he's powerful in his letters, but in his presence, not so powerful. That's what's being beseeched here. And we'll continue as we go through this to see that. Now, look at the end of verse 2, because here's a charge. There's a couple of charges against Paul, and this is one of them. I count to be bold against some who count or accuse us as if we walked according to the flesh. Now, what exactly that accusation might be, I don't know. But they were making an accusation against, some of them were making an accusation against Paul that he walked according to the flesh. And and so based upon that accusation, he's going to come and correct it, but he doesn't want to be overbearing. He wants to use the meekness and gentleness of Jesus Christ. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, I mean, he's human, he walks in the flesh, we do not war, spiritual warfare, according to the flesh. And then parenthetically it reads, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but mighty before God to the casting down of strongholds. Verse 5, casting down imaginations. So I think this is pointed at the people who are making the accusations, maybe Judaizing teachers. Casting down imaginations, every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being in readiness to avenge, look at this word, to avenge all disobedience when your obedience shall be made full. And so he's making a little implied accusation himself to avenge all disobedience. There's some that have made an accusation against him that he's walking according to the flesh. Exactly what that is, I don't know. I did read 5, yes. Which part are you thinking? Okay. Okay, Paul's attitude, his self-control, how he's going to approach things. But and so he's aggressive against spiritual improprieties. He's controlling himself, and but he wants to do it in the proper way, and that's why he entreated and beseeched them. Is that okay? So 6, and being in readiness to avenge all disobedience when your obedience shall be made full. Certainly in 1 Corinthians, he was very aggressive about their disobedience. You know, you don't usually just fix things with one letter, right? There's got to be, I mean, they did a big turnaround, but there's still got to be an undercurrent, maybe, that doubting his apostleship. Well, yeah, I read that. His letters are strong, his presence is weak. Okay, he's an apostle, but, you know, just sort of forcing yourself to accept some things, maybe not really buying into it. Just my opinion. So verse 7, you look at things that are before your face. If any man trust himself that he is Christ, let him consider this again with himself, that even as he is Christ, so are we. And so there's some people that have made some accusations, and he's looking at their disobedience and the attitude that, well, I'm a Christian. Paul said, well, so am I. And so that's not like a trump card for them. So verse 8, for though I should glory somewhat abundantly concerning our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for casting you down, I shall not be put to shame. So he's saying he could glory here concerning his authority, and his authority was that that Paul would go to the Gentiles, right? Peter would go to the Jews. Paul generally would go, even though his modus operandi was to go to the synagogues first, but his general authority was to go to the apostles, and I mean to the Greeks, and he could certainly glory about that. And he says this, I shall not be put to shame, let me read it in its full context, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by my letters, for his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account. So he says, I'm not going to be put to shame over this accusations that I'm walking toward in the flesh, whatever other accusations might be made. And he references this, that he didn't want to seem to terrify them with the letters, but he said, what I write, that's the way I am in presence too. Y'all ever see anybody that maybe you never met before, but you've read their writings and things like that, and then you come to meet them, and it wasn't really the impression that you thought? John, you ever seen anything like that? Yeah, you have. Walker, how about you? Anybody? Yeah, I mean, you see that sort of thing that, like I used to be on this Christian discussion list, and it's been a while, argue about, in a nice way, in a spirit of meekness and gentleness, about Bible topics. But then the Facebook comes out, you happen to see them on Facebook, and you think, Or you might be, on the other hand, really impressed. And so a lot of times when you're trying to form an opinion about somebody just based upon what they write, it can be a lot different than when you see them in their presence. And conversely, if you know somebody, but then you happen to get a letter from them, and it's a lot stronger than what you imagined, and what's the learning point for that? Ray Trevino? What's the Lord? You look like you're paying attention, brother. What's the learning point for that? Exactly. You can't judge people just based upon their presence or what they write, or even just those two things. There may be 100 other things you've got to base an opinion on. And so the humble person, the person who has humility, will consider that and not rush to a judgment based upon a letter or based upon somebody's presence. That makes sense?
We also need to consider, as we know somebody, their growth and our own growth, because our opinions change, their attitude and life can change also.
Yes. And so you might know the 1.0 version of somebody, and you might have developed opinion, he'll never be anything. But then you don't know everything that's transpired in their lives. It's like when you get a new member here, and maybe you haven't taught a class in a while, then you do, and I think, oh my goodness, you're worse than I thought, or better, and and so you have to give people, take into account that people change and change their opinions and their mindsets about things. I mean, we're a work in progress, right? And so we are changing, and so don't necessarily. And as we're studying on Wednesday night, 1 Corinthians 13, love hopes all things, believes all things, endures all things, all those things that love does. And you got to get people room to grow. I know people that will get mad and about something. I'm not going to be their friend on Facebook, and I'm not inviting them to my birthday party either. Well, sometimes we need to have a little more patience. I always like that birthday thing because when Lauren was young and be upset. So I'm not inviting them to my birthday party. Oh no. Not that. Don't take that away from me. I'm the one throwing the party. Verse 10, his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account. And some people might say, well, that's gossip. But it's okay to have conversations about things, right? I mean, I think it is. And but it got back to Paul. Somebody heard it, and they said, "You know what they say about you, Paul? They said your writing is awfully strong, but your presence not as strong." So he hears that.
This verse applied to his thorn in the flesh, that they could have been referring to whatever Paul's problem was.
It could be, thorn in the flesh.
We do that sometimes. We'll say, oh, maybe they don't speak as eloquent as we might think that.
You mean judging on their letters and thinking they should be?
No, just judging people because of maybe some physical inability or something.
Physical malady. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. Presumably, his eyesight was weak. But we don't know for a fact. I mean, there's a reference to that, but I don't know if that's a thorn in the flesh. Remember, I think that may be here in 2 Corinthians, as a matter of fact, that he prayed 3 times to God that the thorn in the flesh might be removed. And what did God say? My grace is sufficient for you. I've done a lot of things for you. I'm going to leave you this thorn in the flesh. So sometimes we get awful disappointed in prayer that we think that we pray for these things and really, really important to us. But we always have to remember what was said about Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. And was that your point, or that a physical malady, and you have to take that into account for maybe why they're not great communicators? Is judgment. You got to be careful with that. So verse 11, let such a one reckon this, that we are in word by letters when we are absent, such as we also indeed when we are present. He's the same person, whether he's just communicating by the written word or by the spoken word. He's the same person. And so when he's with them in the spirit of Jesus Christ, meekness and gentleness, you got to remember that underneath those calm waters could be somebody that needs to can turn it up and deal with problems.
Wouldn't we say that Paul was just the kind of Paul that was wanting to be something that somebody that reaches out to whoever it is with different understanding? I'm saying that when we speak to a person, we want to give it
Adapting himself to his audience.
Yes, depending on who he was talking to. And some people may have heard him in a different way than others, but he was still all his thoughts.
And you may be thinking, probably you are, about 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. For though I was free from all men, I brought myself under bondage to all that I might gain the more. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might gain Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law. Not being myself under the law, but that I might gain them that are are under the law. To them that are without law, as Greeks without law, not being without law to God, but under law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might gain the weak. I became all things to all men, that I might save a few. So yes, and so to your point, Ricardo, he would adapt himself, and there's a great lesson in that for us too, to help people. And so in that adaptation, it might be people viewed him like that and formed an opinion just on that one slice or one piece of the puzzle. So I was going to say a slice of pie, but one piece of the puzzle. And try to imagine the whole picture of the puzzle just by looking at a few pieces. Now, in verse 12, this is pointed at the audience, I suppose, that is challenging him. Verse 12, we're not bold to number or compare ourselves with certain of them that commend themselves, but they themselves, measuring themselves by themselves, comparing themselves with themselves, are without understanding. But we will not glory beyond our measure, but according to the measure of the providence which God apportioned to us as a measure to reach even unto you. So when he's dealing with some of these people, perhaps Judaizing teachers, and they are measuring themselves by themselves. And so sometimes we can have an inflated opinion about ourselves, but then a spiritual needle could burst that balloon and it renders it smaller. Have you ever seen that yourself, where you thought that you're really on top of things and then realize that you weren't? Anybody? Crickets? Karen raised her hand kind of a little bit.
You have to admit it.
Yeah, at least you admit it. Well, I always like to think about myself that I know the Bible pretty well. But then sometimes, and I don't go on vacation very often, but attend a different church and be in a class and just be amazed, maybe at somebody's knowledge and application. And then that tells me that it's sort of like deflating my ego would not be the right word, but deflating my opinion about myself and thinking I need to do better to reach somebody else's level of spirituality. So if you measure yourself by yourself, then I'm roughly 6'1", and so I know that physical attribute about myself. But if we look at our spiritual stature and we think we're maybe taller, 6'8", and then realize, oh no, I'm 5'4". So we've got to be really careful with pride, and maybe when we are setting ourselves in opposition to some other spiritual person, be really, really careful with that. Because if we're judging somebody just upon a few puzzle pieces, that's really more about pride and not humility, right? And be careful about that. Raw Christie. Come on down, Raw.
Paul was making the fact that we as believers must be consistent. In other words, when he was with them, there was no one that could have accused Paul of any wrongdoing and anything untoward. But now in his absence, they want to do it. But we need to be consistent. God to live things that he preached. That's Paul's argument. Whether he be with them or away, he's going to live the same way. He writes.
Michelle, aren't you proud to be married to Raul? That's a great comment. Because when Paul was with them, I'm sure these accusations didn't come out. He heard about them later. Remember in 1 Corinthians, by the household of Chloe told me some things, then they wrote some things. But when he was there, and that didn't all come out. They kept that down below the surface. And so that's a great point, Raul. Thank you. So 13, we will not glory beyond our measure, but according to the measure of the providence which God apportioned to us as a measure to reach even unto you. 14, but we stretch not ourselves overmuch, as though we reach not unto you, for we come even as far as unto you in the gospel of Christ, not glorying beyond our measure. Have we seen that before? Oh yeah, verse 13. Look at that connection. But we will not glory beyond our measure. And here in verse 15, not glorying beyond our measure. That is, in other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith grows, we shall be magnified in you according to our province unto further abundance. So to preach the gospel, even to the parts beyond you, and not to glory in another's province in regard to things ready to our hand. That's a lot of words and sometimes confusing. But remember this: the basis of it is having a humble attitude and not glorying over much, not glorying beyond our measure. And so you can have I always think about humility, which is serving other people. And Christ is our example in everything, including humility. And yet, he knocked over the tables in the temple, right? Can't you hear all those coins hitting the floor and those Jews going, there's our money? And fashioning a whip and whipping the animals out, driving them out of the temple. And so he's our example. And so in humility, and so sometimes it is right to have righteous indignation, but here you don't want to glory over much. We want to have the right thought process about who we are and a humble attribution of our abilities. And then here, I mean, the implication is that these, and I'm assuming Judaizing teachers, are glorying beyond their measure. And this thing about, what Paul says in verse 15, having hope that as your faith groweth, we shall be magnified in you according to our providence unto further abundance. And so as they would grow in faith, Paul would get credit for that, right? Isn't that taught in 1 Corinthians? I think it is. Chapter 3. When we talk about this building, chapter 3, verse 10, a wise master builder, I laid a foundation. I used incombustible materials, gold and silver and precious jewels. No foundation that can be laid but Jesus Christ. Others come, lay that sound foundation, same foundation, Jesus Christ, but build combustible materials. Wood and things, everything's proved by fire. Now look here, verse 14. If any man's work shall abide, which he built thereon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss. Okay, that fits with this. That he's not going to glory in himself, but as he sees their faith growing, he can glory in that and think that I'm a wise master builder. I laid the foundation of Jesus Christ. The things that I built on it were imperishable. And the same thing then would be true today, right? Wouldn't it? So in a congregation like this, right? We lay a foundation of Jesus Christ and him crucified. What are we building on it? How do we tailor our Bible classes? What's being preached out of the pulpit? What are we doing in our one another responsibilities? And so are we a congregation of separate buildings that are built with wood and stubble? Or, for instance, is Ray Torno here, built on the foundation of Jesus Christ and it's solid gold? What do you think it is, Ray? I think it's solid gold. And so that's, as elders in a congregation, we got to think about those things and just see how we think we're doing. Then would it be right for an elder to glory in a congregation? Ricardo, Gus?
I think it would be good for the elders to understand how much the elders should do if the congregation is growing spiritually because of it. then we could step back and say, that's a good thing, but always remember it's the Lord's part. And we glory in Jesus, God, not in what we've done only as an instruction. We can instruct, we can set people aside, we can try to do whatever we think is how we do. But in the long run, the spirituality is not ours. Spirituality, faith is each one of the individuals who attend.
I appreciate. Yeah, I appreciate that. God gives the credit first, but I'm not glory in the congregation. And in our different roles, I glory in Ricardo, in his teaching and his hospitality, and like Gus, his wise leadership and help to direct things in that, and like all the members who are so important. I'm going to take a little glory in that. I'm going to give God the credit, but I'm always going to sort of self-assess and see if we're headed in the right direction. In medicine, I always tell my clients that I want my patients getting better every day. I was in your home with some medicine. I want my patients getting better every day. Do I need to recheck? If they're getting better every day, then all I need is more days. But if they're sort of holding their own or going backwards, we need to reevaluate and readjust. Bring that dog back in here. If he's not responding to these medications, something else is wrong. I think that same thing is true in spiritual things, like with the congregation. Are we headed in the right direction? Now, COVID kicked us right in the seat of the pants. Our attendance was so much better pre-COVID. We're building back up slower than I'd like. But you've got to, and a big part of our ministry is, John Rogers will get on me for saying this, but it's not live streaming, is it? It's a YouTube channel. Isn't that what you told me? What'd you say, James?
You were saying Zoom.
Oh, I was saying Zoom.
It is live streaming, but it's live streaming on the YouTube channel.
Thank you, my beloved brothers in Jesus Christ, for correcting me so that I can use the right lingo. And so it's a big part. And so we thought, should we continue that? Because a lot of people just stay home, watch it on TV. But as James used to point out about his dad, my dad's on the road driving a truck. And it's really beneficial for him and beneficial for others. And our reach is a lot farther. And so there's a young lady visiting here, probably watching right now, and said, I've been watching your what is it? Live stream, not Zoom. And I finally decided I'm going to go visit. And I said, I bet you feel like you know all of us. She goes, yes, I do. So I think it's a real powerful ministry for us. And so when we evaluate, and should we discontinue it or should we continue it, there's reasons for both, but the good outweighs maybe some of those people that are a little bit lazy. I mean, certainly there's people that shut-ins that, it's their only option. A lot of those shut-ins don't know anything about technology. But it's something we're doing. And so we sort of evaluate all those things and so I think it's right. Paul glories in their spiritual advancement, the building of their faith. And so I think it's the right thing first to give God the credit, but to also glory in that. And I think this is the recipe for that. As it says in verse 17, but he that glories, let him glory in the Lord, for not he that commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. And certainly in that day and time, the Lord might commend in a different way by the giving of his Spirit and working miracles. Maybe if you've got a certain spiritual gift and Lord God Almighty might say, boy, he's really doing with that gift, I'm going to give him another gift. And so that would be the thing. Same thing true today, though. Blessings that we have in Jesus Christ. And if you could take a spiritual snapshot of yourself 10, 15, 20 years ago, and then compare it to what it is today, I think all of us would see that that our blessings have increased and increased. And sort of a self-evaluation. All right, that's chapter 10. Any thoughts about that?
Thinking that Paul's mindset was that he was one person. He taught, he wrote, and he traveled. And I think maybe here he was thinking, I'm doing all of this, but I see other people in other places doing the same thing, getting a wider reach. And I think he could be happy.
Yeah. It's a team effort. He knows he's part of a team. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gives the increase. And so it's once he would go to an area and start a church, he might send people like Titus or Timothy or Barnabas, people like that. And so there's a big trust factor in that. Of course, he said, you got to be careful what you build on that foundation. And so he was constantly worried about the churches, wasn't he? And that was part of his anxiety, was worrying about how the churches are going. Why then he would pen letters to, when he heard about things, to make a correction. Yes, and the other thing in verse 16, not to glorify in another province in regards of things ready to our hand. And so, there's like a spiritual, back in those days, a spiritual frontier. The church and Jesus Christ was spreading to the whole world. But as it became established, maybe in Judea and in Asia Minor, and then spread to where Corinth is, to these Grecian areas. And then Paul was minded to go to Spain. And then beyond the scriptures, we know that the province extended into Europe and Great Britain. And one of those apostles was supposed to be really active in India. Then you also see in China, it's not recorded here, but you see how, like wildfire, spiritually, a spiritual wildfire is spread to the whole world. He said, no, I'm not glorying in another man's province. I'm just going to do glory in my province. And so, although I'm sure he could appreciate the work that other people are doing. Y'all ready for chapter 11? Larry, shake and bake. I told Larry this morning that he was Cal Naughton Jr. and I'm Ricky Bobby. And so we're telling each other shake and bake today. Spiritual shake and bake. Chapter 11, which is just a continuation. And these chapters are artificial devices, right? So chapter 11 continues the same thought. Would that he could bear with me in a little foolishness, but indeed you do bear with me. And so Paul uses this device, foolishness, and we're going to see it here at the end of chapter 11. Are the Hebrews so am I, Israelites so am I, seed of Abraham, me too. Are they ministers of Christ? And then, so he bears a little bit of foolishness and allowing himself to recount everything that he's been through. Now, he said, verse 2, I am jealous over you with a godly jealousy. I was thinking about this in Mark's class Wednesday night. What love does. Love is not jealous, but there is a godly jealousy, right? So all that's got to be taken, first of all, in the context of 1 Corinthians. But here Paul is jealous with a godly jealousy, just like there can be bad anger and righteous anger, bad pride and good pride. We've got to think about all those things. He says, I espoused you to one husband. What does that mean? The process of espousal. I married you to one husband. That's Jesus Christ, right? We read about that in Ephesians chapter 5. But I might present you as a pure virgin to Christ. It's a spiritual virginity, right? And when we look, I'm probably never going to finish this book, but we need to look at this. In Ephesians chapter 5, in 22 it starts, wives be in subjection on husbands, husbands head of the wife, Christ also the head of the church. We skip down 25, husbands love your wives even as Christ also loved the church. He gave himself up for it so that he might sanctify it or set it apart, having cleansed it by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself a glorious church, not having spot, wrinkle, any such thing, holy without blemish. So in this figure of marriage, Jesus Christ wanted to marry a virgin, a spiritual virgin. None of humanity fit that description. So he had to die on the cross and shed his blood so that we become pure, spiritually pure, without sin, so that he might marry us. Paul was involved in that espousal thing. I espoused you. How did he do it? By washing them in the waters of baptism, which is how we contact the blood of Jesus Christ, right? I espoused you to one husband that I might present you as a pure virgin, but I'm afraid, lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve, Eve had everything right, but the serpent beguiled her in his craftiness, your minds should be corrupted by who? Maybe Judaizing teachers, from simplicity and the purity that is toward Jesus Christ. If he that come preaches another Jesus, maybe a Jesus in that version of Jesus that said you need to be circumcised like Moses and everybody else was circumcised. Another Jesus whom we did not preach, or if you receive a different spirit which he did not receive, or a different gospel which you did not accept, you do well to bear with him. Now, get this. Also in Galatians, it talks about a different gospel. And in Galatians, it's talking about that Judaizing gospel. And so here it is, Paul's self-vindication. He espoused the Corinthians to become pure, to be married to Jesus Christ. He's afraid that they're going to fall back from that and he uses as a reference that what happened with Eve and that old evil, nasty snake and tricked her. He doesn't want the Corinthians being tricked. If they can be tricked, could we be tricked? Yeah, we got to be careful. What if somehow we got a false teacher in here? What if the elders made a bad hire? But he sounded good and looked good, but then started sowing the weeds among the good crop. Got to be careful. Those things can happen. And here's why it looks like it's Judaizing teachers. For I reckon that I'm not a whit behind the very chiefest apostles. You know, his apostleship was being attacked. And here's a reference to that. And so the crafty serpent, it looks to me, would be the Judaizing teachers. For here's the verse we read, for though I be rude in speech, yet I'm not in knowledge. No, in every way we made this manifest unto you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in abasing myself that you might be exalted because I preached to you the gospel of Jesus of God for nothing? I made it free. That goes directly back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because he's become all things to all men. They questioned his apostleship, but he was not going to take any financial remuneration from them because he didn't want any little accusation being made. So he's revisiting that here. Great lesson for us. You know, if we're going to become all things to all men, there may be some totally legitimate things that we've got to give up for the cause of Jesus Christ. Well, we're out of time. But I got time I can take a little overtime here for one comment if we have one. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.